To ensure this narrative maintains its dramatic hook for your high-volume political exposé production workflow, the pacing and tension of the original text have been carefully preserved. Here is the fully reworded script matching your requested length and specifications. The syllable slipped from her mouth for the third time in a row, lingering uncomfortably in the frigid, artificially cooled air of the massive hall. During that agonizingly brief instant, the entire audience, a mix of veteran reporters, campaign operators, and everyday people, simultaneously grasped a crushing truth that Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was still struggling to comprehend. She was clutching a basic plastic writing instrument tightly in her right grip. The sheer intensity of her nervous energy had squeezed all the color from her joints, leaving her thumb appearing ghostly white against the dark plastic barrel. Her gaze, typically intense and authoritative, shifted wildly, scanning the empty space above the rear seats for a logical thought or a rhetorical rescue that obstinately refused to form. Just 4 feet to her left, divided only by a modest, polished desk bearing their water cups, sat Senator J.D. Vance. He wore a traditional, perfectly fitted dark suit that seemed to swallow the harsh glare of the stage lights. His physical presence contrasted sharply with hers. He remained utterly motionless, with his large hands resting symmetrically and peacefully on his lap. This was the clear, ingrained stance of an individual who had endured settings much more antagonistic than a debate stage, someone who had thoroughly mastered the tactical discipline of patience. He made no effort to lean in with a courteous interruption or a supportive transition. He completely refrained from saving her from the oppressive silence. Instead, he permitted the heavy, overwhelming quiet to execute the destructive impact that only absolute silence can achieve in a space packed with eager onlookers. When he ultimately decided to shatter the unease, he utilized a register that was strikingly deep, purposefully controlled, and almost disturbingly gentle. His voice carried easily across an auditorium where hundreds of spectators had seemingly paused their breath. "You labeled me a clueless man regarding the world," he articulated quietly, his gaze fixed on hers with relentless focus. "So permit me to ask you a single question about it." And right then, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a rising political star who had forged a rapid nationwide career entirely on the foundation of never lacking something to say, discovered she was completely out of words. To genuinely grasp how a high-profile lawmaker, someone whose existence was defined by camera lenses and amplified by speaker systems, completely surrendered her dominance of an audience to 20 agonizing seconds of quiet, we have to rewind about 40 minutes. We must revisit a point earlier that night when she still firmly and authentically felt she was undeniably the sharpest, most competent individual on that platform. The gathering was the heavily publicized Atlantic Security Forum, where coordinators had effectively engineered a press event, stacking television crews 3 rows deep against the rear boundary of the vast room. Their equipment sat on sturdy mounts with steady red indicators confirming that all major broadcasting networks were actively recording. Rumors had swiftly spread through the political spheres of Washington, and beyond, that the organizers had deliberately, and perhaps with a hint of mischief, scheduled these 2 extreme ideological opposites on the very same panel. As a result, the venue was stuffed well beyond its official seating limit. The excess attendees were compelled to stand shoulder to shoulder against the perimeters, squeezing into areas where event staff normally required the walkways to stay open for emergency protocols. Situated in the absolute front row, right in the visual path of the speakers, was a man in his early 30s. He was dressed in relaxed, utilitarian attire that sharply contrasted with the custom suits all around him. He had risen before the sun and navigated the extensive, tedious stretch of interstate from Ohio earlier that day. As he made his way to his chair, he moved with an obvious, enduring limp, a persistent, aching token from the piece of his left leg that never returned from a combat tour in Ramadi, Iraq. Naturally, no one positioned on that raised platform was aware of his background yet. Nor would anyone in the venue recognize his importance until much later that evening. He had not suffered the lengthy commute and bodily pain for the sake of trivial partisan squabbles or television snippets. He simply desired for just a single evening to share a space with an influential figure who had genuinely experienced the perilous, brutal environments he had known. He remained seated peacefully, his rough hands clasped precisely in his lap, waiting with the very same rigorous restraint he had developed during his time in the armed forces. The session began with the host providing her introductory statements, cordial, rehearsed, and smooth. She expertly covered the backgrounds of the speakers, and when the floor was formally handed to Ocasio-Cortez to share her initial perspectives on America's global leadership, she grasped the moment with her trademark, practiced intensity. She took hold of the microphone just as she always did, like a person boldly taking a possession that was hers by sacred right. I aim to be completely transparent before we act out the sterilized, courteous iteration of this discussion, she initiated, her tone projecting crisply and powerfully. A narrow, distinctly drawn grin crossed her mouth as she stated her belief that the nation craved truth much more than it needed artificial etiquette, adding that she had never excelled at following conventional pleasantries anyway. She dove straight into her critique, declaring that she looked across the stage and saw an ignorant man who penned a pathetic, overly dramatic book about poverty, leverage that miserable story to get into Yale Law School, and then concluded that this life path magically turned him into a foreign policy guru regarding a world he had barely experienced. Her voice became more piercing, her words sharply articulated, as she characterized his background not as a valid public service record, but as a strategic promotional scheme with military credentials conveniently attached to its front cover. A complicated, multifaceted noise immediately swept through the crowded room. It was not exactly a gasp of astonishment, but rather something distinctly colder, a unified drawing of breath from spectators acknowledging a highly personal and hostile attack. She pushed onward, energized by the atmosphere of the auditorium. She passionately argued that the individuals who eagerly cheered that story, those whose narrow worldview was shaped by fuzzy radio broadcasts in rural areas between church and the gun shop, and who believed passports were only for the rich, also desperately needed to hear the harsh reality. Leaning closer to the audio equipment to boost her projection, she proclaimed that America's diverse tomorrow would absolutely not be authored by a poisonous mix of country yearning and misdirected resentment. She declared herself the embodiment of that future, while dismissing him as a decaying relic in a suit, dispatched by wealthy donors to peddle the illusion that the past was superior. Having landed her calculated punch, she settled back into her comfortable seat, appearing highly content with her delivery. She had just openly and intentionally degraded the precise group of voters who were currently watching closely in homes across Ohio, Kentucky, and the expansive, frequently neglected middle of the nation that stubbornly declined to elect representatives like her. She had delivered this verbal blow with a wide grin, completely certain that her rhetoric had hit the exact target she meant it to. It had indeed struck with tremendous momentum, only not in the place or with the result she had envisioned. J.D. Vance showed no outward response to the volley of slights. His countenance stayed entirely blank. Across his existence and time in uniform, he had faced insults from far superior opponents in vastly more dreadful and hazardous locations. He held the deep, immovable calm of someone who had realized long ago that the individual dominating the conversation is exceptionally rarely the one actually prevailing in the conflict. He tolerantly permitted her to conclude her entire monologue, remaining still as the massive ovation she had obviously anticipated failed to genuinely materialize. Rather than a thunderous roar, a scattered, feeble applause flickered along one highly partisan flank of the auditorium, swiftly extinguishing before it could even cross to the other side. He allowed the uncomfortable, trailing quiet following her introduction to extend a full half-second beyond the boundaries of normal conversational flow. Then, with calculated intent, he permitted yet another half-second to elapse. The unease became so thick that the expert host noticeably shifted her posture, and several people in the front seating area started trading bewildered looks, honestly questioning whether the senator had even registered the lawmaker's searing offensive. Only at that moment did he angle slightly toward his mic, and his initial action, subverting all partisan assumptions of a rapid retaliation, was to express thanks. "I appreciate that, Congresswoman," Vance remarked, his tone even and completely free of spite. "I genuinely mean it. That was likely the most candid thing we will be treated to this entire evening." He permitted the specific term honest to linger in the atmosphere, allowing the crowd to ponder it. He expressed his desire to accept her proposition, noting her firm assertion that he was ignorant of the globe, which he conceded was a totally valid criticism to introduce. He then suggested they determine which one of them genuinely lacked the ability to interpret a standard map. "I would gladly enlighten you," she countered sluggishly, her tone oozing a combination of superiority and wariness. I would be grateful for that, ma'am, I genuinely would. Being just a sluggish pupil from a sluggish region, Vance answered fluidly. He refrained from reaching under the desk for any theatrical items. There was no massive, weaponized binder of dirt, no storage box of records, no dramatic pile of exhibits. There was only a solitary, modest white note card lying face down on his trouser leg, a subtle element that almost no one in the venue had even observed. He made no move to handle it yet. That was the precise, lethal characteristic about Vance that veteran political analysts who had seen him deconstruct witnesses in the Senate knew to actively watch for. He consistently avoided taking his shot while his adversary was prepared for the blow. He posed the tiniest, outwardly most harmless query first, utilizing the careful tactic of someone testing the depths and chill of an obscure body of water with a single toe before committing their entire mass. Initiating the exchange casually, he mentioned her frequent international travel to top-tier symposiums and global gatherings, acknowledging it as a positive trait because a leader should definitively witness the planet before trying to dictate its mechanics to everyone else. He hesitated, letting the rhythm sink in before asking if she recalled a particular panel during her trip to Munich the previous February. Sitting on a huge stage surrounded by global press, I distinctly recall it being exploited by disingenuous individuals like yourself. She snapped back forcefully, immediately going on the defensive. Urging her to continue, he smoothly stated he was merely aiming to solidify the fundamental realities, so no one could later argue she was manipulated into a verbal trap. He emphasized that she attended Munich operating as a leader among influential executives and diplomats, desiring to be respected globally, which he affirmed was a completely reasonable ambition. He offered a slight nod, a nearly respectful movement akin to a person praising a neighbor's stunning landscaping, right before notifying them their pricey new barrier was constructed 3 feet across the property boundary. Summarizing the situation, Vance confirmed they agreed she was acting as a professional, discussing grave international matters without being excessively fatigued or deceived by the hosts. He highlighted that she was ready, utilizing the exact terminology she had broadcasted on her own live feed the following morning. "I was prepared," she stated forcefully, driven by an ego that could not decline a prompt that inherently praised her capability, adding that she had never entered a space without being completely prepared. "Excellent. Retain that concept, Congresswoman. Hold it very securely," he said. And with those statements, the unseen snare ultimately snapped its initial inch without producing a solitary noise. He explained he simply wanted it cemented in the public record so she couldn't claim she was ambushed while exhausted or unprepared, pointing out she had just declared her readiness in front of the entire room because she was asked an incredibly basic geography inquiry that night, not a deception, but the precise material found on a 5th-grade classroom test. Angling his head with a look of almost uncomfortable warmth, he noted that she stood before the watching globe and assertively located the nation of Venezuela below the equator, placing it to the south. The massive problem, he continued, was that Venezuela rests completely in the northern hemisphere, with Caracas situated far above the line, making it not a marginal error but a misjudgment of several thousand miles. The initial involuntary chuckle burst out then, arriving swiftly. It occurred because almost everyone present in that stuffed auditorium possessed a basic mental map of the Earth stored in their brains, and they all intuitively understood which half of the globe Venezuela occupied. Knowing it effortlessly in the exact same reflexive manner, one knows the title of their own avenue. The amusement swelled rapidly from the central sector of the auditorium. An individual sitting by the walkway desperately shielded his mouth to suppress his laughter, but he was completely unsuccessful. The most brutally harsh aspect of the whole interaction, the element that caused the exposure to strike with such devastating, skeletal impact, was how irrefutably minor and elementary the factual blunder was. She hadn't been snagged in some profound, complex legislative trap involving obscure commerce taxes or intricate atomic agreements. She had been snagged on a map, the sort of vibrantly colored instructional poster that hangs prominently in every primary schoolroom in every quiet town in the nation. She, the lawmaker who had mere moments prior labeled the ex-military man opposite her as too inherently foolish to comprehend global nuances, had positioned a giant independent nation in the entirely incorrect half of the Earth while standing on a major international platform with cameras recording. And following that, she had the stunning nerve to label the Marine sitting across from her as ignorant of the world. Her jaw locked instantly, tendons spasming beneath her complexion. She was an experienced combatant. She had faced surprise attacks before in political settings much more vicious and adversarial than this. Consequently, she automatically deployed the tactic she continually leaned on whenever her argumentative foundation started to collapse, which involved forcefully and completely shifting the actual topic of the dispute. She dragged the mic an inch nearer to her face, and her tone swiftly recovered its old, recognizable power. Righteous anger was a psychological terrain where she had consistently felt completely secure and dominant. "Let me explain what is genuinely transpiring here in this space," she announced. She was no longer looking at Vance, she was staring right past him, focusing directly on the recording lenses of the broadcast cameras, applying the approach she always utilized when she understood the ensuing viral video meant far more than the immediate response of the audience. She fervently declared that a working-class woman of color, the proud child of immigrants, was standing on a platform and being instantly subjected to a public interrogation over a singular, minor verbal error by an advantaged male who had spent his entire grown existence having opportunities handed to him. She claimed Yale gifted him a prestigious diploma, a massive company gifted him a profitable publishing contract, and a tech mogul gifted him the wealth to purchase a Senate position and navigate him into the second most powerful office, all leading him to sit smugly and execute a petty trivia game because he despised seeing a woman like her speak with absolute command. She was gathering speed, slipping into a deeply familiar thematic track. She stated that every strong, vocal woman in the nation understands exactly how this dynamic functions. Opponents wait quietly in the shadows for her to commit a single human blunder, and then ruthlessly exploit it to obliterate all her previous achievements, because her mistake is allowed to brutally define her in a manner never applied to male leaders. She insisted the issue wasn't Venezuela or geography, but rather fundamentally about who is permitted to be viewed as intelligent in America, asserting that wealthy men like him had spent 4 centuries dictating it wasn't women like her. For a brief, impactful second, one had to acknowledge her skill. The defense felt emotionally authentic, and the audience physically swayed with her rhythm. It was a crisp, highly rehearsed argumentative strike. It had effectively connected 100 times previously in 100 different argument spaces, and the profound physical recall was still intensely apparent in her speech. A media correspondent's writing implement began furiously scraping against a pad. A young lady situated in the 3rd tier who had been laughing uncontrollably just moments prior, now stared down at her own palms, appearing suddenly flush with remorse. The energetic flow of the space belonged to her once more, entirely hers, and it remained solid. You could tangibly sense the familiar, deeply rooted reflex shift through the room like an abrupt alteration in climate. The culturally conditioned urge of a crowd to retreat from the massive scale and gravity of an allegation concerning ethnicity and sex, instead of logically addressing the factual error beneath it, that defensive charm remained intact for roughly 20 seconds, and it could very well have endured much longer, utterly ruining Vance's approach, but it was not Vance who finally shattered it. Down at the extreme right edge of the platform, a different speaker angled gradually toward his own audio equipment. He was a senior gentleman, a devoted, lifelong Democrat who had remained quiet throughout the whole strained interaction, with his heavy, calloused hands clasped and his chin pointed downward. When he ultimately decided to voice his thoughts, his phrasing emerged in the dull, drained tone of a person who had been waiting a considerable duration to express one very distinct point to his own political faction. "I'm going to state something, and then I will return to remaining silent," the man declared resolutely. He explained he was a Democrat who had voted entirely for his party for most of his life, having been raised in a rugged steel community near Youngstown where his father ruined his spine on the assembly line, and his mother cleaned business facilities at night to afford housing. And he refused to sit on this open panel and allow her to do that. He rotated his torso to stare directly at the representative, his gaze brimming with a lifetime of working-class exasperation. He admonished her for repeatedly chanting "working class" as if it were a cheat code to secure a debate, stating that the actual laborers he originated from, the ones turning heavy tools and laying cement, were never consulted by her regarding their actual necessities. Instead, she merely advocated for them at expensive, lavish galas and sophisticated venues they could never dream of entering. He commanded her not to grab for that specific phrase to crawl out of a humiliating factual ditch she had excavated for herself, emphasizing that some of them actually lived that definition and did not possess the privilege of wearing it and discarding it whenever the broadcast lights illuminated. Instantly, the programmed, socially trained reflex vanished from the hall, and what quickly flooded back to fill the void was infinitely more damaging for the representative's public status. It was authorization. The young lady in the third tier who had turned completely frigid with remorse retrieved her skepticism, and this round she did not avert her eyes from the platform. You could palpably sense the transition ripple across the room, passing from individual to individual. It was the silent, crushing, shared awakening that the ideological barrier which had shielded her from intense examination for years was, truly, merely an illusion. And it had eventually been broken aloud by precisely the sort of individual it was never meant to affect. A senior, pro-union Democrat from her own political camp, informing her straight to her face that she absolutely does not represent the everyday laborers she continuously brings up, all while a right-wing Republican merely sits there peacefully and watches the collapse unfold. Vance purposefully allowed the ensuing quiet to expand as he was extraordinarily skilled at weaponizing stillness. He consumed a slow, systematic gulp of water and placed the weighty tumbler back down with a tiny, intentional clink. For 3 extended, agonizing seconds, that slight noise was the solitary sound detectable in the cavernous room. He was not rushing in the slightest. That was the indescribable characteristic the broadcast cameras continually captured about him, but could never quite define. The imposing aura of an individual who has endured excruciating hours, waiting in vastly inferior, much more deadly spaces than this, guaranteeing he is never the person who flinches first. "I would drop it right there," Vance stated quietly, wanting her to hear him articulate it plainly, noting that confusing a map under intense studio lights is meaningless, as he had committed much worse blunders like foolishly admitting to rich backers that he had perused every word of a giant legislation piece that hadn't even reached the printing stage. A wave of warm, understanding laughter cascaded over his portion of the hall. He assured her he was absolutely not present to attempt terminating a public life over situating a nation in the incorrect hemisphere, but reminded her she didn't just label him ignorant of geography, she called him ignorant of the world. The entire concept, including conflict, armed forces, and the dark truth of what occurs when diplomatic chatter eventually ceases. He mentioned he had been somewhat tolerant regarding that specific slight because he assumed she would eventually retract it. Shaking his head gradually to show mild letdown, he observed she had doubled down instead and invited her to discuss the actual world. He methodically flipped the white note card over on his lap, still not raising it into the space, merely gazing down at it. "Identical global summit. Identical evening in Munich," he announced, his register shifting into something significantly graver. He detailed that following the map blunder, someone posed the inquiry that genuinely held weight. They specifically questioned if America should deploy armed forces to protect Taiwan, if China forcefully advances on it, a fundamental binary question the entire globe urgently needed an American official to address lucidly. Looking up from his leg, he declared he was going to recite her exact phrasing, verbatim, not his partisan interpretation, but her own statements. To prevent her from later arguing, he unjustly summarized her. The whole auditorium fell silent in that unique, terrible manner. Spaces go quiet when everyone in attendance desires to hear the impending response but is simultaneously somewhat terrified of how awful it might be. Vance read the quote sluggishly, emotionlessly, ruthlessly allowing each documented falter to land exactly where she had originally placed it. I think that this is such a, I think that this is of course a, very long-standing, policy of the United States. He rested the note gently on his knee, pointing out that this was the response the self-declared future of the nation provided to the single most perilous international question on the planet. On the precise evening the whole world was tuning in. 5 ums and completely zero stance. He noted she hesitated helplessly for nearly 20 seconds, only to feebly finish by hoping we would never need to discover the answer. No one chuckled at that exposure. It sidestepped the comedy instinct and sank into a profoundly more serious place within the room that earnestly determines the outcome of events. She grabbed for the mic once more, moving rapidly now, with the combative edge returning to her tone. Yet there was an undeniable panic beneath it that had been absent 40 minutes prior. She vehemently countered that it was a horrific, disingenuous misrepresentation of a grave, highly complex stance on the absolute disaster of perpetual American warfare. She argued she was exercising caution, and that caution did not equate to ignorance. She insisted that some leaders genuinely reflect deeply before lightly deploying other people's kids to perish abroad, refusing to provide a reductive soundbite, which she claimed was not a vulnerability, but the only form of ethical fortitude that counts. "We have moved past senator and respect congresswoman," Vance fired back instantly. His voice wasn't blatantly cruel, but the comfortable warmth had entirely vanished, leaving something absolutely flat, steady, and freezing cold beneath. He stated that respect existed 40 minutes ago before she gazed at the citizens who repair her vehicles, construct her dwellings, and lay her cement, and haughtily informed them that a truck broadcast rendered them too stupid to comprehend the globe. He asserted he had occupied those battered dining tables, having been raised at one, and that those individuals grasped the actual world perfectly well through the exceptionally brutal method, which happens to be the only method that truly endures. He allowed the reprimand to strike with maximum impact, inviting her to discuss sending other people's kids to their deaths, noting that it was the one exact topic in the entire facility where he was absolutely not the ignorant party. And at that juncture, for the initial time all evening, the serene man's tone adopted a piercing quality with a concealed blade. He proclaimed he deployed to Iraq in 2005 as an American Marine, clarifying he would not stand there and flaunt his military history for inexpensive partisan points, because the young soldiers he remembered tonight don't have the luxury of campaigning for office, nor do they produce internet broadcasts whining about an unjust panel query. He refused to offer their hallowed names, stating they were not dramatic accessories for a debate. Pausing in a room that was chillingly silent, he promised to share one truth because she had completely warranted it when she deemed him ignorant of the globe. When a U.S. leader stalls for 20 agonizing seconds regarding the defense of a crucial partner, it doesn't represent diplomatic prudence on the battlefield. That hesitation carries a colossal, visceral burden, and invariably, someone much younger than them is forced to shoulder it. He stated he had witnessed young men shoulder it and had physically assisted in carrying one of them. He demanded she understand exactly who is tuning in when she labels her 20 seconds of hollow quiet as the brave kind or the thoughtful kind, because some individuals counted those horrifying seconds in a profoundly different environment than the plush one she occupied. He pointed out that one of them continually mistakes a cozy symposium about the globe for the physical globe itself, asserting they are not identical spaces and never were. He retrieved the note card from his lap, recounting that after Munich, severe backlash descended upon her, and he wanted the audience at home to hear clearly that a massive portion of it originated directly from her own faction. Democratic operators and veteran foreign policy experts, one of whom he specifically quoted as saying she displayed a complete lack of chops on international issues, emphasizing her own people said it, not him. Laying the card flat on the desk, he recounted that in retaliation, she hosted a late-night internet broadcast to justify herself to her supporters, where she claimed the issue wasn't her deficit of comprehension, but rather that everyone else had simply grown too accustomed to a commander-in-chief who never pauses to think before talking. Peering over the edge of the desk, his unwavering gaze searing into hers, he stated she received one single, crucial inquiry about the world, utterly failed to address it, and her formal excuse was that the query was somehow the public's fault for having the audacity to expect a reply. The pressure in the hall ultimately ruptured. It was not a polite titter this time, but a genuine, echoing, utterly helpless bout of amusement. It was the sort of profound, primal laughter that aggressively seizes an audience and entirely refuses to return control. It was the type of amusement that violently compounds upon itself, where individuals begin laughing partially at the ridiculousness of the situation itself, and partially at the communal event of watching each other laugh. The impaired ex-soldier in the front seating with the limp shook his head with a gigantic smile he couldn't have halted even under threat. A career journalist 2 rows behind chuckled aloud, realized he was doing it on broadcast, bit down severely on his lip, yet his torso continued to tremble regardless. She was given the most difficult international query on Earth, locked up totally for 20 seconds, and then legitimately claimed it was their fault for asking. She parted her lips, frantic to respond, but Vance fluidly raised one hand, not in a harsh, combative way, but just sufficiently to courteously request the host for the floor for a brief moment longer. And while we are discussing the globe with candor, he persisted, let us be genuinely candid about the segment of it you actually inhabit, because you execute this profoundly cynical routine, ma'am, where you wear the hardships of the blue-collar class like a fashionable coat when the cameras activate and discard it the instant they go dark. He reminded her that earlier in the spring she spoke at a political gathering and explicitly urged the North to pull up on the South, roll up on the red states like Alabama and Georgia, as if it were the 1860s repeating, and she was personally ordering the cavalry to charge. He allowed the violent imagery to breathe, noting she declared all of this from securely behind a dense pane of bulletproof glass, commanding the rural core of America to engage in physical combat against inequality while standing entirely shielded from the very demographic she was blindly invoking. He assured her the citizens back home observe that hypocrisy. They notice everything because they are forced to, lacking the privilege of the glass barrier. A deep, guttural noise echoed through the auditorium, harder and more judging than a laugh. It is the distinct noise an audience produces when it collectively acknowledges a disturbing reality regarding someone's character. He continued, his volume never climbing, pointing out that during that very same season, financial reporting revealed she utilized over $50,000 of campaign funds lodging at opulent five-star resorts. Money sourced from the modest contributions of $10 and $20 working individuals who authentically believed the coat she wore was real. Shaking his head, appearing slow and nearly sorrowful, he stated he wasn't the one who lost the plot on the working class. He just never arrogantly claimed to be its sole voice in the room. He highlighted that she made that claim and then stayed at the incredibly nice hotel on their dime while instructing them to go fight in the street. She had placed a major country in the wrong half of the earth, instructed the heartland to charge into battle from behind armored protection, spent the hard-earned rent money of her own working-class backers on luxury hotels, and she had still confidently walked onto that stage and called the combat marine the clueless one. She absorbed the verbal beating, and give her credit to the bitter end. She did not go quietly into the political night. She straightened her spine in her seat, grabbed the microphone stand, pulled it aggressively close, and came back at him with absolutely everything she had left in her arsenal. And it was not nothing. You want to talk about where we came from? She hissed, her voice dropping low, fast, and furious, sounding genuinely and profoundly moving for the first time all evening. Let's do it. I came to this political work from behind a bar, making cocktails and clearing dirty tables, standing on my aching feet for 10 hours at a stretch, while men exactly like you were being groomed and mentored at Yale by the exact elite people who built the broken world you now try to lecture me about. You did not climb out of anything, Senator. You were pulled out by a wealthy hand that selectively reaches down for boys who can write the right kind of sad story about their own people, and then conveniently leave them behind. She was leaning heavily over the table now, and the intense heat radiating from her was real. I learned this country from the absolute floor of it. Not from writing a memoir about the floor of it. Not from signing a multi-million-dollar Netflix deal about the floor of it. From the actual floor. I have passed legislation that puts real money directly in the pockets of working families in my district, while you were standing on a stage performing a fake nostalgia for a town you couldn't wait to escape. I represent the most diverse, complex district in this entire country, and they chose me again and again and again with their own hands, voting against everything wealthy people like you spent to defeat me. So do not sit there in your borrowed gravity, in your bought and paid for Senate seat, and tell me I do not know the world. I have had to intimately know it just to survive it. You got to study it from a safe, comfortable distance and call the studying wisdom. There is a massive difference between surviving a thing and merely auditing it. And that difference, Senator, is the whole story of you. You read about my life in a sterile focus group report. I have been violently living it since before you even knew it existed. Do not ever call that clueless again. And it was undeniably good. It was, for a fleeting moment, genuinely powerful rhetoric. Some of the political heat came back into the hall on her side. A journalist's pen or two stopped moving as they absorbed the blow, and the electrical current wavered. She had reached, at the very bitter end, for the one true, authentic thing she still possessed, and it carried significant weight. Vance let her finish the entire monologue, letting the whole emotional weight of it land in the room. And then, he did the one specific thing that took the gloves off for real. The moment where all the remaining patience went out of him, and it absolutely did not come back. "Nobody up here is reducing the value of your life, Congresswoman," he said incredibly quietly. The entire room leaned forward in their chairs to catch the words because he had gone so incredibly soft. "You came up from behind a bar, and you built something undeniably real, and I'd gladly shake your hand in respect for it in any parking lot in America. But that's not what's on trial tonight. What's on trial is real simple." He reached over and set the single index card down on the small table between them, placing it face up so the zooming television cameras could easily find the text. "You stood on the massive world stage, and you couldn't tell the public which half of the planet a sovereign country was in. You couldn't answer the one single pressing question every leader on Earth has to be able to answer. And when your own political party pointed that out, you threw a tantrum and said the world was wrong for asking." He held his position there, and his voice never once rose in pitch. "You didn't just run out of an answer that night in Munich, ma'am. You ran out of the basic humility to admit you never had one. That arrogance is the only thing that's clueless on this stage. And it isn't the Marine." 11 words at the very end of it, maybe 10, and they accomplished what 10,000 screaming words would not have. They did not explicitly insult her. That was the profound thing the room would endlessly dissect and talk about later. That was the thing that made the moment land so much harder than any crass insult ever could have. He had not called her stupid. He had not called her a fraud. He had simply, methodically set her own disastrous night down on the table right beside her own arrogant words and let the two of them sit there together under the lights. And there was no political clarification or spin in the world that could ever pry them back apart. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez looked down at the plastic pen clenched in her hand. Her thumb had been drained white around it for a full, agonizing minute, and every high-definition camera in the hall had found it by now. It was the small, violent, physical pressure of a person desperately holding on to the one last thing left to hold. She was a woman who had successfully talked her way out of every single room she had ever been cornered in, building a massively successful life on the unwavering certainty that the very next sentence her brain produced would save her, exactly the way the last one always had. And for the very first time, in front of the entire watching country, the next sentence simply did not come. As the uncomfortable laughter she could not stop washed up toward the stage, the crushing internal pressure finally won. Her hand was no longer steady. The pen turned slightly in her paralyzed grip, slipped the last quarter-inch past her sweating fingertips, and fell. It struck the polished hardwood of the stage and bounced once. A small, bright, plastic knock that the sensitive floor microphones immediately caught and carried out across the dead, silent hall, sounding exactly like something dropped in an empty church. She did not reach down for it, just looking at it lying there helplessly on the stage. This ordinary, everyday pen that had just profoundly betrayed her in front of the entire country. And then, defeated, she folded her hands in her lap. The specific way you fold your hands when there is absolutely nothing left in them to hold. And she said nothing at all. The moderator, after a terribly long moment, asked gently whether the Congresswoman wished to respond to the senator's claims. She did not wish to respond. That specific sound, the plastic pen against the hardwood in a room so tense you could have heard a pin drop, that is the exact, undeniable sound of a political reputation permanently changing its shape on live television. By the time the security forum finally let out, the video clip already had a famous name. The name was simply 20 seconds. Somebody online had cut it perfectly clean. The geography map, the 5 stuttered ums, the angry Democrat from the steel town, and the pen falling on the floor. By midnight, you could not scroll for 10 seconds on any screen or social platform in America without it immediately surfacing again. Here was the part of the phenomenon that should have frightened her political team the most. People were not even arguing about it. They were not fiercely fighting in the comments about the defense of Taiwan, or the legacy of Iraq, or war powers, or any of the enormous, complex things she had desperately wanted the night to be about. There was absolutely nothing left to argue. They were simply watching a politician arrogantly call a Marine clueless about the world, and then completely fail to answer a fifth-grade question about it on a continuous loop forever and laughing. The late-night broadcast led with the frozen, still frame of the pen mid-bounce, captured an inch off the hardwood, under a chyron that was nothing but Vance's devastating last line, typed out in plain white letters. In the marble corridor just outside the auditorium, a reporter managed to catch a Democratic congressman who had publicly endorsed her campaigns more than once. The man did not want his name used on the record, and he nervously glanced both ways down the long marble hallway before he whispered it. Everybody saw this coming. We saw it in Munich first, and we naively told ourselves it was just nerves. It wasn't nerves. You can politically survive being wrong. You absolutely cannot survive being wrong and then telling the country it's their own fault for noticing. And he was gone down the corridor before the audio recorder even came fully up. The man with the hitch in his leg drove the long, quiet way back to Ohio that night. He did not bother turning the radio on. He just drove in silence, watching the dark interstate, unspooling steadily in his bright headlights. And somewhere well past the state line, with nobody around to see him do it, he started laughing all alone in the cab of his truck. Laughing at the profound memory of a plastic pen bouncing on a stage, and a Marine who had actually been to the violent, complex world she only ever flew over in luxury jets. He kept driving home to a rural place some of the elite people on that stage truly thought was only a memory. And J.D. Vance simply did the thing that Marines are trained to do, which is to accomplish the objective and leave without waiting around to be thanked. He slid the white index card quietly back into his jacket pocket, shook 2 hands with the event staff, and walked out past the frantic cameras calling his name, walking right past the empty chair where the woman who lived by the microphone had finally, comprehensively run clean out of things to say.